There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. Sometimes when you do an interview, there's an elephant in the room. Something or someone who is there but not actually there. From Mamamia, I'm Mia Friedman. You're listening to No Filter. And today, that elephant is Gwyneth Paltrow. Because for 7 years, my guest used to be her 2IC at Goop and was instrumental in turning the company into a wellness empire. You'd probably recognise Elise Loehnen's face because in her role as Chief Content Officer, she hosted the Goop Lab TV show on Netflix and the Goop podcast with Paltrow. And the thing that you need to know about Elise is that all of that is the least interesting thing about her. In 2021, Elise walked away from that extremely high-profile job to do something very different, launch her own podcast and write a book. This wasn't actually a new thing for her to do. She'd already ghostwritten a dozen books in her career, including a bunch that hit the New York Times bestseller list. But this was the first book she'd written with her name on the cover. And if I had to review it with a single emoji, it would be that one with the top of the head missing and smoke coming out. It blew my mind. It's called On Our Best Behaviour, the price women pay to be good. And if I had to expand that review beyond an emoji to include actual words, they would be, this is a book about the way the 7 deadly sins have been used to control women's lives without us even realising it. Sloth, envy, pride, gluttony, greed, lust, and anger. Don't be angry, don't be hungry, don't want more for yourself, don't be a slut, don't want, be quiet and be small. That's how to be a good woman in the world. And we've internalised those ideas since we were born. Not from any individual man, but from the culture. And then from each other. And once you see it, I promise you can't unsee it. This book and this interview with Elise has changed the way I see the world and the way I see myself. And I'm excited that it's going to do the same for you. Here's Elise Loehnen. Elise, I want to start with your 1 month hyperventilation because that's where you start the book, actually. You hyperventilated for a whole month, which sounds incredibly uncomfortable and also inconvenient.
Yeah. And I'm sure people listening have an idea of hyperventilation as breathing rapidly into a paper bag.
Yeah.
And that's not actually what chronic overbreathing is. And so I'm also sure that some people listening will finally get a diagnosis for something that they actually do. Chronic hyperventilation is when there's a mix-up between your brain and your body, and your body's oversaturated with oxygen, yet the feeling is that you cannot take a deep or full breath without yawning. And this first happened to me in my 20s. It was so stressful. As you can imagine, you feel like you're dying, that I went to the emergency room and they sent me home with some Xanax and a pat on the back and told me it was all in my head. And I've had persistent on and off chronic hyperventilation ever since. And I've had access to sort of every healing modality. My dad, ironically, is a pulmonologist too in my life, and I could never get my arms around it. And of course, wanted a physical reason or something that I could just quote unquote treat. But what was so clear to me was that it was a combination of stress, sleep deprivation, and then overcaffeination and some other intangible quality. And so I opened the book. I was 40 years old. I'd spent my whole life achieving and pursuing excellence in every corner of my life. And yet there I was feeling broken and like I was asphyxiating in my therapist's office because I had been hyperventilating for a month, maybe close to 2 months. Every afternoon, I would present to sort of the world as sleepy, and yet I was feeling like I couldn't breathe. I was just yawning through life, exhausted. And
inside, did you feel panicky? Because is it like a panic attack?
It's very panicky. It's panicky and exhausting. I know not to go into a full panic attack at this point. I know what's happening to me, but it's more just this despair and exhaustion of just like, let me breathe. And I was at sort of the end of my rope, to be honest, of feeling like I'd spent my whole life achieving, pursuing safety and security, these ideas of like, someday I'll feel good enough, someday I'll feel done, I'll feel safe, whatever it is, whatever this anxiety sort of hungry ghost is that's pursuing me, these voices in my head. And then I just had this revelation. I'm at somewhat of an apex in my career. I have 2 children. I'm married. I've done it. And yet I feel awful. And I had to sort of stop running and turn and face these hungry ghosts to understand even what they were, and that they weren't actually mine, that they weren't coming from my husband or my parents or my coworkers. They were cultural ideas about what it is to be good. And I couldn't outrun them. I had to face them. And, at that point, it's not even sort of conscious, but everything in my life started to move and shift as I began to assess, like, what is it in me that's cattle prodding me off the couch so that I can't even sit through more than 20 minutes of a movie before feeling like I need to do something? What is it in me that's chastising me for even wanting a piece of pizza or taking a bite, much less like the 2 or 3 that would actually satisfy me, or 4, What is it in me that insists that I shouldn't be upset about any number of things, that I should stuff all of those emotions? Like, what is that? And that was really the genesis of the book. This idea that women are coded for goodness, conditioned to pursue goodness at all costs, whereas men are programmed for power. And for a woman, there's nothing worse than reputational damage and harm of saying someone's a bad woman, a bad mother, an uncaring, unloving, horrible person. That's the worst thing you can say about a woman. Whereas the worst thing you can say about a man is that he's weak. He can do all sorts of egregious things, and we sort of continue to revere men so long as we perceive them as powerful. And I kind of knew that, but I hadn't really understood how it had been internalized in me and how I was enacting that in my own life.
By all objective measures, your book on our best behaviour, The Price Women Pay to Be Good, is based on this framework of how we've internalized the 7 deadly sins, and we conform and contort ourselves and our lives to try and be good by not indulging in any of these sins, right? So by all objective measure, at this time in your life, was it 2018 or 2019?
2019.
2019. You were the Chief Content Officer at Goop, which is like second to the top. You had a Netflix show that you hosted. You co-hosted a podcast with Gwyneth. You had 2 children. You were slim. You were successful by any measure. You were earning good money. You were good. Like, you had ticked every single one of these boxes. You were not slothful. You were not gluttonous. You were not angry. You did not seem grasping or overly prideful. Your public persona was very much one of humility. You were like the second banana to Gwyneth on Goop. So you ticked all the boxes. Was it your body just saying, I can't do this, I'm not being true to myself?
Yeah, I think it was, traveling almost every week, co-hosting a show, trying to be quote unquote a good mother, though I was often not present, which only made me try to show up even more when I was home. I've always ghostwritten books on the side for extra cash. So it was this breathlessness, this like, I am grinding at a level that is unachievable. Like, I can't maintain this, and I feel bad. I feel bad when by every measure, as you said, I should feel good.
But the cost of this is too high.
The cost is too high. And sort of, what are you even chasing? What I was pursuing, or this idea, these standards that I was holding myself to, were ultimately becoming oppressive. And I recognized too that it's funny, you mentioned, the 7 deadly sins is the superstructure of the book. And I wasn't raised in a religion. I had to look up the 7 deadly sins. I didn't know what they were. And actually, they're not in the Bible. They're cultural edicts. I was raised in this hippie alternative family. I went to a school without grades. My parents are both sort of liberal and feminist. My husband's a feminist. I'm the primary breadwinner. So I wasn't also raised in sort of a patriarchal construct that felt oppressive. So if anything, I was like, of all the people, I should feel the most free. I think that is why I felt free to write a book like this. I wasn't destroying anything. I wasn't bringing shame on my family by, talking critically about the church, etc. Although the book's not really about religion anyway. But yeah, to me, it was one of those things where I was like, if this is in me, then this is in all of us. And that these voices that I hear are clearly cultural ones. And I could recognize that. But it's interesting, I think, how so many of us, we're so accustomed to these invisible, yet insidious and ever-present voices extolling us about what a good woman looks and behaves like, that you think that they're personal. You think then it must be your family. You're trying to find some place to put it or someone to blame. And the reality is that they're so woven into culture, and then we police them in ourselves and most sadly police them in each other.
We so do. And you've said that once you see them or once you know them, you can't unsee them, and you start seeing these everywhere. So I want to dive into a few of them, or as many as we've got time for. And I want to start with envy, because you had a conversation with a well-known therapist and author called Lori Gottlieb, and she said to you that as a woman, you should pay attention to what and who you are envious of, because it tells you something about what you want. Firstly, what's the difference between envy and jealousy?
Yeah. So there's a very important difference, because we hear jealous a little bit more. It's more common. It feels slightly less icky. Jealousy requires a third. It's typically a drama triangle in a relationship, right? There's someone who's pursuing your partner or spouse, or you're both after the same date to prom, whatever it is. That's typically how jealousy emerges. But envy is one-to-one. It's much more intimate. You are envious of what someone has. You want what they have. And I think that envy is so shameful. It just sounds bad. And women, as Lori Gottlieb pointed out to me, I asked her if in her experience, her client's experience of envy was gendered. And she said she didn't have data, but that women are much more anxious about feelings that we perceive as bad or shameful. And so my theory, and why I think envy, if people take any chapter from the book, I hope it's envy, because I think it's the gateway to the other sins. And that what happens with women and what we perceive in culture as women on women hate, or the way that we're hard on each other, is typically undiagnosed envy. So when we see another woman and we have sort of this rage towards her, annoyance, irritation, it's this, I don't like her, or who does she think she is, or she rubs me the wrong way. That woman is doing something or has something that you want for yourself. And she is pushing on a dream you have for yourself. And if you start paying attention to it, it might not be the whole thing, but it might be, I feel so critical of Mia's podcast. Like, you're tearing Mia down, because actually you're like, I want a podcast.
Do you know what I did when I was preparing for this interview? I was looking for other podcast interviews you'd done. And I found one with a podcaster I won't name, because it's not actually about her. It's about me, for the reasons that you say. And the first thing I did, she'd done an interview with you. She's quite well known. And the first thing I did when I found it, I was like, oh my God, it's 2 hours long. And the first thing I thought was, who does she think she is? Not you, but the podcaster, right? Because it's only men like Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss. They do podcasts that go on for hours and hours. Women's podcasts tend to be fairly short because we wouldn't dare take up that much space, right? So then I thought, I'll start listening. And she talked about herself and her feelings about your book a lot for the first, 5, 6, 7 minutes. And again, I found myself getting enraged. And I realized after I read the envy chapter that that's about, I'm envious that she's so confident to take up space, when I've internalized the idea that to be a good woman, you can't take up space.
Yeah.
Who were you envying in 2018 and 2019? When I imagine a lot of people were envious of you in your life. You looked like you had it all. But who were you envious of then?
Oh, writers, certainly people sort of making it onto the New York Times bestseller list, betting on themselves. And again, it's so uncomfortable to admit, right? Because my immediate defense is like, I've always been the champion of other writers. All I want to do is help people sell books. This is all true. And yet there's that part of me, which still can come up, where I'm like, oh, how did she do that? I want that. Like, oh, that book's not that good. Whatever it is. And it's only in the process of writing this book that I've begun to see that in myself. And now to twist it, what I think is so amazing about envy is that you think it's so bad. That's why we project it onto the object rather than allowing ourselves to feel it. It's like, get it out of my body. It's bad. And then we sort of denounce and trash each other, which also feels really terrible. But what I think people will find as they start to let it come up so they can diagnose it is you're like, oh, that's not so bad. I feel fine. This is great information. I've processed this. I've released it. Now I can actually be happy for her, and I'm going to study her and figure out what she's doing and how I can do the same thing. So instead of saying, because we're also so conditioned by scarcity, which is the chapter on greed, but we look around, right? And we're like, there aren't that many top female podcasters. It's dominated by men, only interviewing other men, I will say. Mm-hmm. As you said, taking 4 hours of your day. But when we sort of tear each other down rather than getting behind each other, we're just sort of playing into this idea of scarcity, that because you have it, I can have it too. Rather than saying, okay, Mia's killing it. I can do this. There's space. There's appetite. There's interest. And so how can I get behind her? Men are better at this because they don't have the same scarcity. So it's like even interesting in the podcast world, talking to these other female podcasters as my book comes out and being like, we need to get organized. Mm-hmm. Like, we need to organize in the same way that the men are all WhatsApping each other and sharing information and pumping each other up and sending each other through the ranks whenever they have a project to promote. We need to respond similarly and find ways to get behind each other. But part of it is dealing with envy. And I'm so glad you offered yourself as an example, because what also happens, and I'm sure you've had this experience, when you don't really understand what that is, and you'll look at a podcast review and you feel it. And then the minute you're sort of like, okay, this is actually projection. I get that this person who's criticizing me and saying I talk too much or don't talk enough or I'm too prepared or not prepared enough wants my job. And like she or he should do it. I think it's such a powerful reframe. And one of those opportunities that I think could dramatically change things for women and move us past this idea, this cultural, social idea that it's in our nature to do this to each other. Yeah. I don't think it's in our nature. I think it's just a cultural rite of passage with its roots in envy, and that we could start interrupting it quite dramatically and start interrupting it with each other to be like, okay, wait, tell me that other mom at school, like, tell me why, because you'll notice that like whoever drives you crazy is not the same as who drives your friends crazy. So like, what's she doing? Is it that she's so forthright? Is it that her children are so well behaved, like that she has such a big career? What is it? What's the information? Where is your soul sort of knocking on the door and saying, pay attention to this. This is important information for you.
After the break, we dive into the biggest way that we muffle ourselves throughout our lives and the surprising reason why things suddenly change for women at a time when we least expect it to. You wrote a New York Times opinion piece about envy recently and about your mum. And you talk in the envy chapter of the book about the mother-daughter relationship and how envy plays into that, which was so fascinating to read. Can you speak a little bit about your mom and how you saw her wants and subverting those wants affect her life and then yours?
Yeah. So this is a really important part of the envy chapter, which is so many of us don't know what we want because one, we're conditioned to believe that all of our wants should be subjugated to other people's needs, that it's selfish to want things for yourself. Maybe after everyone's needs are met, then you can have what you want. That's, I think, the primary cultural conditioning for women. But it means that most of us don't have good models for what it really looks like to prioritize yourself. It doesn't mean that you don't love your kids, that you don't love your partner, but there's just not a lot of examples of this in culture. And so I wrote a New York Times op-ed about my mom who didn't want to have kids. And she was born in 1950 in Iowa, the oldest of 7 in a Catholic family, food scarcity, lack of security, certainly, a parentified child. They were all raising each other. Her mom was definitely disinterested in her kids / not kind. And, my mom, for her, she went to a nursing college to pursue some sense of security and married my dad. They met at the Mayo Clinic. My dad's a doctor and signed up for his dream, which is to have kids, even though she didn't want them. And I completely understand the choice she made. This is also sort of simultaneously during second wave feminism, where there's all of these women who are choosing to be childless, who are choosing to sort of bet on themselves and go for it. And some of her friends did that and or had both in some way. And so my mom, her anxiety drove her towards security. So having her as a mom was fascinating because she was also very honest. Like I was never really confused about where my mom's heart was. I knew she loved us, but I also knew she had little tolerance for sort of the trappings of motherhood, which hurt my feelings as a kid. But as a grown-up, it's very powerful and liberating for me, if that makes sense, to see a woman, my mother, who was so clear that you can love your kids and not love being a mother, that you can love your kids and refuse to pray at the altar of motherhood. And I write about this ambivalence that so many mothers feel, particularly with their daughters, where they've sacrificed their own ambition, their own lives so that their daughters can choose differently. And then how, as a daughter, every choice you make somehow impugns your mother, right? You can choose to do what she did and quote unquote, waste your potential or the opportunities that she gave you. This is if you have a mom who's worked in the house. Or you can choose something else. And then that too says like, oh, what my mom did isn't enough for me. And so I think that there's just so much, it's not well discussed because culturally they're so conjoined and conflated. There's so much shame, I think, for women who feel like quote unquote unnatural mothers or don't really want to spend their days crawling around on the floor. And we don't constrain men in the same way at all. So it was really important for me to say it because I feel like when it's not said, and this has certainly been the experience for a lot of my friends, they can sense their mom's feelings. They can sense their mother's unexpressed rage, resentment, and they think it's them.
Yeah.
They don't know that, no, their mother loves them. She just hates sort of the practicalities of motherhood.
Or her just mental absence, like that she's very distracted, that she's just, you know. My kids this morning, one of my kids said to me when I asked her something, she's like, you just never know what's going on. You just never know what's going on, like at school or whatever. And I was like, because I've been a parent for so long, like 26 years. My eldest is 25. So I'm like, yeah, like I've been doing it for a really long time, the mother thing. And that muscle's just really tired.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also not that interesting to know what's going on at school and to remember all your teachers and, all your exam results. And I feel bad about that. I feel terrible about that because society tells me that I'm a bad mother, even though that expectation would never be there for a father. But it's interesting the way that envy plays out in family dynamics as well.
Yeah. My oldest is 10, so you're a little bit ahead of me. But what I see playing out with my friends too is I was born at the end of the 70s. And so I grew up in the 80s. It was like an era of benign neglect. So my mom was doing a lot of volunteer work, et cetera, but she wasn't consumed with playing with us and, you know, all of the stuff. It was like, go outside and play. I'll see you at dinner. And now we're doing so much more childcare and sort of home housework than our parents' generation did. And what I see too, particularly amongst women, and it's hard to find, it's like even some of the quote unquote women who work in the home also have like side hustles and some of it pro bono, et cetera, that they're doing. So it's rare to find anyone who has one job in our culture. But what I see happening too is there's this cultural pressure to ratchet it up. So they're working really hard at work and then they feel like they have to counterbalance it with effort at home. So instead of saying, oh, I was on a book tour, I'm exhausted, it's like, oh, I've been absent. Now I need to parent at 200% and be so present to try to quote unquote make up for. It's very strange, but that's what I see happening too, this like ratcheting up as we try to achieve quote unquote balance.
I want to talk about lust. When I worked in magazines, I remember very clearly an issue where we had on the cover, does your sexual history make you a slut? Which even my editor at the time later regretted because she thought that maybe it was a little bit too confronting. But the idea of slut shaming is so pernicious in our culture. And we've thought of it as something that men do to women, but women do it to women as well, don't they? And the whole idea of your book and all of these sins is that it's not directly about men. It's about how we've internalized it and we use it to oppress ourselves and each other.
Yeah.
How does slut shaming and lust play out for women?
Yeah. I think this is such a complex and interesting chapter because I've been interviewed by one man so far about this book, which is interesting in of itself and says a lot. And he does sort of a literary podcast. I don't think he'd read the book, but he was like, you say lust is a sin. I like go to Venice Beach and all I see is sort of women's bodies on display. And I feel like, you know, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, well, that's my very point too, which is that there is such an essential distinction between sexiness and sexuality. And women are trained for the former. We are supposed to be objects of desire and yet never ourselves desiring. Mm-hmm. And I see this, you know, with younger women too, where it's like, I don't want to body shame or slut shame anyone. And yet the performance of sexuality for girls who are not yet even sexual, you know, I think if you ask them and you said, hey, do you masturbate? What do you like? Does your partner know what you like? Do you want a vibrator? They would die, right? Die of shame because they're not actually sexual. They're just performing an idea of sexiness and desirability for our culture. And so I think that chasm becomes completely confusing culturally. And then you get into this idea of where we're at culturally. And maybe it's better in Australia. We're sort of so behind. It's just woeful in the US. But you think about sexual assaults, and of 1,000 sexual assaults that are reported in the United States, only 25 go to trial. And
it's not that different here.
It's not that different. Yeah. And so there's this idea for girls, for women, that it is your responsibility to keep yourself safe, that anything that happens to you is ultimately you've elicited some sort of out of control desire on the part of a man. We are set up as the babysitters of rapacious male desire, and it will eventually devolve to, were you drinking? How were you dressed?
What time was it? Were you alone?
How many sexual partners have you had? Yeah, this is what we're set up for. And so, yes, women are as hard on other women. Some of it's out of concern because we understand the culture and that will always be perceived as our responsibility, or it will be perceived as our responsibility until women really start changing this for each other.
I love what you said about the difference between this performative sexuality, which we see in the hypersexualized culture. Mm-hmm. Like, I was looking at red carpet pictures of the Cannes Film Festival, and there's, I think it's Adriana Lima, who's a former Victoria's Secret model. She's got a kid or 2 kids, is in her 30s, and she's pretty much just wearing undies on the red carpet. The height of daring at the Met Gala and cool is to go wearing practically nothing, like being nude. But back to your male podcaster who said, but women are being so lustful on Venice Beach. That's about male lust, though. Like, I don't know a lot of women who are like, I'm on this red carpet or I'm on this beach with my stomach stuck in, I'm hungry, I've got a G-string up my crack, my boobs stuck out. I'm not feeling sexy. I'm performing sexuality for the male gaze, essentially.
Yeah.
The cultural gaze.
The cultural gaze. And there's such a difference, I think, when you meet a woman or see a woman, or a man for that matter, who's like deeply sexual being. And it kind of has nothing to do with appearance. I've been with friends, like sex therapist friends, who've done a lot of work on being embodied. And it's amazing, the magnetism of these people who are like really feeling themselves. And again, it's not about their quote unquote hotness, or like they'll be in a tracksuit and people are crossing the street to pet their dog or buying them a coffee. It's almost like not a sexual thing. It's like a magnetic thing. And being empowered and running sort of that sexual creative energy through your body. And I think most of us have no idea how to turn that on or how to access it. And that to me is so different than what we perceive as like a desirable woman, where it really is about being an object. And again, people should wear whatever they want, but I think that the way we conflate these two ideas is very harmful. And yes, it's all about, as Deborah Tolman writes, girls are taught to be desirable, but never desiring. And that's a devastating truth, I think.
I want to talk about anger. I don't know if you are perimenopausal, but one of the biggest and most confronting symptoms of perimenopause for me was the anger, was the rage, the absolute unbridled rage that could come out towards my children, towards my husband. And it felt very unsafe. It felt unsafe for them, but it felt unsafe for me. And I remember after a bout of it, I took myself for a drive because I felt so out of control. And as I was driving, I was aware that I was driving with one hand over my mouth. And I was talking to my therapist about it afterwards. And she said, that's because the fear that you have of what just came out of you and the shame. Tell me a little bit about how we're conditioned not to be angry as women.
Oh God, it's so deep. I can feel the pain in my jaw from like how I clench and grind. I think so many of us are muzzled and terrified of our anger and stuff it and internalize it. And I think you talk to people like Gabor Mate, they'll talk about how internalized anger can be depression. It can be violence against ourselves. And this is the thing. Socially, we're so hard on angry women from the beginning of time. You have Telemachus telling Penelope in the Odyssey to essentially shut up, mom, go away. That's like the first time in our written history is like, stop talking. She's upset with him. And the book is so much also about sort of the way that we conflate nature and culture. We'll never really understand who we essentially are without culture. Culture is such a formatory force in our lives, who we're told that we are. And so you get this idea about boys and girls that nice girls don't get mad, nice girls don't have aggression. Well, everyone has aggression. It's healthy and normal, boys and girls alike. And boys are conditioned to have their aggression in overt ways, pushing and yelling. We don't really ever teach our kids proper social, emotional, like conflict resolution and how to have healthy conflict. I think that's also why our world is so polarized. But boys are allowed to express it. Girls, on the other hand, are definitely conditioned away from it. And there's this idea that girls aren't aggressive. And so it comes out in covert ways. It comes out as gossip, alliance building, backstabbing. It's all covert, all unspoken. And I don't think that that's who we naturally are. I think that that's just the way that we're conditioned to express all of our frustration, resentment, impatience, irritation, anger.
And crying, you know, the angry cry that women do, particularly at work when you feel like you're so angry you cry.
Yes.
Because that's more socially acceptable.
It's more socially acceptable. And often anger can be a secondary emotion to grief, shame, and fear. So there is that. But more often, it's just like we have no proper avenue for expressing it. And yet it is alive in us. And the thing that's so powerful and potent about anger is that often it's righteous. It's full of information. It shows us what our needs are. It points out where our boundaries have been crossed and violated. And the reason when you talk to people like therapist Harriet Lerner, et cetera, that women are so loath, particularly in our patriarchal culture, to express their anger is because it can cause social exclusion. It can threaten relationships. Like if we start changing and demanding more of our partners and our bosses, they could leave us. We could be fired, whatever it may be. The fear of relationship loss is so entrenched that we hold the line and preserve the status quo and just don't know how to make ourselves heard. Marshall Rosenberg, who wrote Nonviolent Communication, is amazing on this because there's also this tendency, it's not just for women, to find someone to blame, right? Like I'm going to blame you, or I'm going to blame myself, or I'm going to blame the system, et cetera. And he has this incredible reframe where it's like, I'm angry because I am needing this. I am angry because I am needing that, rather than you didn't do the dishes, so now I have to do the dishes. It's like, I am angry because I am needing support. And I am angry because I am needing to not feel like I'm the only one who cares about the cleanliness of the house. You know, there's something about it where you're clearly articulating the need without blaming the other person for your emotions. And that's sort of the art. It's like taking care of ourselves, doing the emotional hygiene, even of like, why am I upset? What am I needing? What is happening here? And then how do I articulate it to get those needs met without sabotaging myself, without denying myself, without pretending like those needs aren't justified and real?
I feel like the new way our culture has learned to silence women's anger is with the stereotype of the Karen. Where if a woman is angry about something, she's dismissed, condescended to, and demeaned as being a Karen and mocked, really.
Yes. I have a lot of thoughts about this, that the dumping ground, like all the extreme misogyny that's completely acceptable, that's directed at women, at quote unquote Karens, and not to suggest that women don't need to be exceptional allies, et cetera. But it's amazing what's happened as like men continue to sidestep all accountability. And it's sort of the only place the trash bag holder is Karenism. Yeah. In a way that I think just is not helpful because it's making people scared, you know, and I write a fair amount about race and anger and the experience of being a white woman and trying to be an ally and learn durability also, because we're so scared of being called bad, of being canceled, of whatever it is, that the minute things sort of reach a boiling point or there's pressure or there's rage, our tendency is to collapse and or sort of exit stage left, right? At the beginning of 2020, just watching all these female founders resign, just like go away. It was like, no. Like stand there. We can all learn together. We can process all of this essential feedback and keep going.
It's interesting because the Karen stereotype in Australia doesn't have those kind of racial overtones as it does in the US. I know in the US it's overlaid with the idea that it's a white woman who is complaining usually about a black woman of a lower socioeconomic class, like in the service industry. In Australia, it doesn't have those same overtones. But
interesting.
I think also when you look at black women and the trope of the angry black woman, that's also used to silence black women who might feel angry. So there's a tool available to silence all women who might feel angry. And as we get older and our estrogen drops in our 40s and 50s, the estrogen is the approval hormone. It's the kind of making everything nice for everybody hormone. And when that falls away, it's a bit like being in a constant state of premenstrual syndrome where it's not that you're a different person. It's just that all your socialization about not to speak up falls away. And it's like you just stripped back.
Well, this is what I think is so exciting because for so long, and I write about this at the beginning of the book in terms of how sort of this brief overview of how patriarchy, Judeo-Christian patriarchy emerged. And part of it was the desecration of the old woman. We have, the witch craze across Europe where 80 to 100,000 women and some men were persecuted and killed. The primary targets were old women. And it's so strange to imagine a culture that would, one, commit gendercide, and that two, would sort of single out wise women who were often widowed, had property and wealth, were the healers, were the midwives, were initiating other women and girls. You look at a witch, right? The cauldron and the broom, those are the signs of the housewife. The cat is a symbol of the goddess. Like throughout culture, you see the desecration of the older woman, the crone, and it's pretty remarkable. And you think about where we are socially and culturally, and it is because we are missing and we have made invisible and erased a whole essential quadrant of wisdom. And so thinking about where we are now and watching sort of Gloria Steinem and Jane Fonda lead the crone army. I'm sure neither of them would like being called crones, but I like the word, even though the etymology is terrible. But you think about women who are coming up behind them, who are just different. And that's what's so exciting. It's like, if we could re-venerate the older woman
I'm here
and
for that.
rethrone her. Yeah, watch out.
I'm ready to be rethroned as I enter my 50s and become a grandmother. Whoa, that is actually not the end of my conversation with Elise, because we did have to talk about one of the most elephanty and powerful chapters in her book and in her life, gluttony, and the way diet culture and the wellness industry brainwash us into being hungry, depriving ourselves of the foods we want, and replacing them with, bone broth, lemon water, and Ozempic. And I also wanted to talk to her about what the culture of weight loss has done to women and to her. On the subscriber episode, I ask Elise about how the culture of cleansers and detoxes became the new way for women to punish ourselves, and also about what her life looks like now. What changed after she left her very big job at Goop, made her life smaller, and stopped denying herself the things that she wanted. There's a link in the show notes, and you can listen right now if you click there. You can find Elise's book, On Our Best Behaviour, at any good bookstore, and I urge you to read it, send it to your friends. It is honestly epic. Our executive producer is Eliza Ratliff, with sound production by Madeline Joannou. I'm Mia Friedman. If you want to hear a little bit more of this conversation, remember there's a link in the show notes. Thanks for having me in your ears.